This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought and to debate. I'm your host Gilad Halpan, and every week I'll be engaging in close encounters of the intellectual kind with writers, scholars, researchers or simply people who have done something to make our lives a tad more interesting. I'm now joined here in the studio by Dr. Erika Weiss. She's an anthropologist at Tel Aviv University and author of Conscientious Objectors in Israel, Citizenship, Sacrifice, Trials of Fealty. It was recently published in English by Pennsylvania University Press. Hello, Erika, and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Thank you for having me.
So I'd like to start to take issue with the concept of conscience first. In the Israeli public debate, the very title of conscientious objector tends to be dismissed as some fancy and pretentious way to mask your true intentions, which are political. That is, those people who call themselves conscientious objectors refuse to serve in the occupied Palestinian territories, not because it blights their conscience or something flowery and fancy like that, but because they want to make a political statement, one that would greatly resonate in the media and, by implication, tilt public opinion in favor of their way. So how did you tackle this concept in your work?
Well, one of the issues we're facing is that conscience, the concept of conscience has a long history and has developed in very interesting ways and has within it a number of contradictions. And one of the issues that conscience itself, the idea of conscience, is trying to push, if you can say that a concept is trying to push an idea, is that it's apolitical and that it has to do only with someone's personal conscience. So within that, the idea that you can make an ethical decision that will be a public intervention but not have political consequences is by itself kind of problematic. So, in a way, the Israeli audience is picking up on one of the issues that conscience always has everywhere.
No, but what they're saying is the detractors is that it's just a pretext.
Well, this is, from my research, absolutely not the case. You cannot meet these people and see what they have kind of gone through personally and politically and say that this is not some kind of authentic ethical moment, ethical act, that they're not concerned with the kind of repercussions of their own actions. I don't think there's a way to speak with them for any length of time and not come to the conclusion that it is definitely a question for them of conscience in a very, very strong sense. And
in the Israeli case, in the Israeli context, how did this question evolve over time?
Well, it's very interesting because you actually look and you see that there are a number of debates at the beginning of the state that have exactly to do with this issue. Now, the phenomenon of conscientious objection really didn't emerge in Israel until the 80s, at least not in an organized fashion, until the Lebanon War. But before that, you have people who are deciding on the defense laws, who are talking about this, who are trying to figure out what the defense laws should be, and they're really, really concerned about issues of conscience. And they even phrase it that way about we don't want our soldiers to be just obedient. We don't want them to be cogs. We want them to be able to think for themselves. We don't want them to just be pure discipline. We want to make room for this. In the end, how this gets articulated in law is very fuzzy, and it's a bunch of compromises. But the issue has been on people's minds since the very beginning.
The legal aspect is perhaps more formalistic and less interesting. I'm more interested in, and you perhaps as well as an anthropologist, but I'm more interested in the way it's perceived in the public debate.
Well, it's how it's perceived in the public debate. When these people first started...
Let me narrow it down. It might help you this way.
Sure.
Can you compare, or in what way has the question of conscientious objection evolved since the 1980s? If you compare a case in the Lebanon War, the first Lebanon War, to a case in the most recent Gaza war, you would say that the way it was received and the repercussions that it sent were quite significantly different.
Well, you have a lot of things going on. One is that these original conscientious objectors were all combat soldiers. And they made this intervention. I would say that was true in the 80s. That was true in 2002 and 2003, that you have this very strong show by male, Ashkenazi for the most part, combat soldiers, often in elite positions, that are stepping forward and saying, we can't do this anymore. And that makes a very, very clear kind of message to society. There was a lot of let's say, positive response, even with people that disagreed with them. The fact that they were willing to go to the jail, the fact that they had already served in the military, all of these things that had already demonstrated their sacrifice was able to be received by society as really to their benefit and testament to their authenticity and the authenticity of their intentions.
As a part of the symbolic capital, perhaps.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Since then, you have a number of complicating factors. One is that the military has gotten smarter about these issues, that unless you're really wanting to make a public statement, they're going to let you out. And they have made it harder to collectively organize because of this. Another is the whole shirking language that they've brought to the forefront, that people that don't want to go to the military, it's an issue of shirking, which brings all sorts of connotations of selfishness and so not kind of nobler intentions. Which has really caught on in the public discourse. So people are immediately saying, well, how much time did you spend in jail? How much were you willing to sacrifice? And if you already decide before you go to the military that you don't want to serve for reasons of conscience, you don't have a lot of space to do that. And you don't have a lot of space to make an impact on society because this shirking language is going to come out immediately. So a lot of people have been kind of pushed out of the movement by the efforts of the military, but also kind of the hegemonic notions in society of who is sacrificing. So women.
So maybe
without social capital.
Maybe ironically, what that development, that progress has done, is to take this issue and bring it back to the personal realm, to the realm of the conscience per se.
It's possible. It's possible that it's become just a much more individual phenomenon now, but that, in terms of collective organization, is really complicated. And then you have all sorts of people that are individually trying to make statements to the press and not getting a lot of traction. And the whole Shmoneh Me'atayim phenomenon, you're not sure exactly where this is going. It becomes a lot fuzzier than it used to be. And these really strong collective letters that people used to write that really, it got them on television, it got them in front of the press. They were able to make these really strong statements. Today, I'm not even sure that that's possible.
Yeah, so you mentioned that the first, or perhaps until very recently, the profile of the average conscientious objector was male, Ashkenazi, upper middle class. And there is some sort of notion that, the whole thing of conscientious objection is some sort of a foreign liberal discourse that they tried to impose on Israel that is, at the end of the day, in danger.
It's not entirely fair to phrase it exactly in that way.
No, but that's part of the backlash, because they're saying, okay, you can talk about conscience and human rights and what have you, but at the end of the day, what we're fighting for is our existence.
Well, part of the backlash, what I'm saying it's not fair, I mean, also the other side of that is part of that backlash is fair. Meaning that if you, for example, don't want to go to the military, not because you're concerned with the political situation, not because you're worried about Palestinians, but because you feel that in Israeli society you've been treated unfairly, or your family has been treated unfairly, that you haven't gotten social services, that you haven't been supported by the state, and you just don't feel the need to contribute back, in quotes, because you didn't get anything, that's not considered conscience by a lot of formal conscientious objectors. But I see no reason not to consider that as ethical refusal as well. So they've kind of been excluded by this conscience language, because when you're doing something for your own benefit, It's not considered conscience.
Are you talking about mainly feminists or Mizrahi sort of?
Or from more refusal from the periphery, that it was never recognized, or that has been going on for longer than conscientious objection of political conscientious objection, but was never recognized as conscientious for these reasons.
But not just these reasons, perhaps because they had a much smaller social capital, they were much less visible.
Much less visible, much less privileged in terms of, when it may seem trivial to someone who is coming from a privileged background, but not going to the military, it means going to jail, means not earning a living for that time period, not supporting your family. This is not something that everybody can do. And then if you get a personal reputation in public, there are a lot of jobs you won't be able to get. There are some people that can absorb this blow, and there are a lot of people that can't.
You mentioned it earlier, but I'd like to focus on it more now, about the way the army grapples with this question.
Yeah.
And it does constantly, doesn't it?
Constantly. Well, I mean, they have evolved together with the movement, and they have not been stupid about it at all. They, at some point after 2002 and 2003, and this is according to military prosecutors and people from the
Just to put it in historical context, it was the height of the Second Intifada, a Palestinian uprising during which hundreds of combat soldiers came out.
Especially elite combat soldiers, pilots commandos. After that, they kind of had an epiphany and realized that the army had a bit of an epiphany and realized they were creating martyrs, that basically by punishing these people and drawing them out and putting them on trial, they were giving them a stage, that they were giving them exactly what they wanted, and that these days they don't want to encourage that kind of response. So they don't want to punish them in that way because it just gives them access to the media more readily. So basically, if you want to get out of the military these days, it's much easier. It's personal accommodation. It makes this refusal a personal issue, a very individualistic issue, not a collective issue. It separates your political opinions about what you think Israeli society should be doing from what you personally need to do. And this separation is huge. This is very significant. So it means that you don't have to, as they say, serve the occupation. You can just leave and then take your public, political opinions with you out, but you're just a private citizen.
Right. I have perhaps a methodological question now to you as an anthropologist.
Sure.
Because you focused on two groups in particular, Combatants for Peace and New Profile, two groups that are active in promoting this question into not just proselytizing, but also bringing this question to the question of conscientious objection to the center of the public debate here in Israel. And as an anthropologist, someone who implicates herself in her research, which is, I hope, a fair description of your work. What kind of things did you, as an anthropologist, bring to the table that other historians, political scientists, and other social scientists were unable to?
Well, I'm not sure if other people are unable to.
But focused on other issues.
Sure. I mean, I think that the question is always, what kind of empathy are you bringing to your research subjects? How do you identify with them? And what should the relationship be? And this is a very complicated issue. I think that the way that you could, people usually want to know, are you on their side or are you against them? Or are you trying to be objective? That's usually how people ask such a question. And I'm saying, none of the above, or all of the above. I'm not sure, but it's on their side in the sense that you always want to approach your interlocutors, the people you're working with a lot of empathy, but also recognize that they are trying to get something done. They have an agenda. That is not your agenda. In a sense, you're not trying to look at whether they're right or wrong, but you're trying to examine how the sausage gets made on both sides. So I wanted to look at their discourse, the ideas that come from behind their discourse, how they use rhetoric to express these ideas, and then look at the state and how the state is bringing certain other contradictory ideas to the forefront, how the state is using rhetoric and hegemony, all these things, to bring their position to the forefront and see how these things clash in public. More than trying to swallow whole what either side is saying or deal with it necessarily on their terms.
And also another, I don't know if it's an elephant in the room, perhaps it's a cat in the room, the fact that you are American and you...
I am.
Yes, as our listeners can hear. There are some Israelis with a very convincing American accent, but yours is authentic. So, look, to go back to my question from the beginning of our conversation about the liberal discourse superimposed on the Israeli reality, because you grew up in America with a certain understanding of what conscientious objection is.
That's right.
Also in the I'm assuming liberal milieu that you come from. Can you tell us a bit about the difference between and how you fill this gap?
Well, I think that these issues are in some ways. There are commonalities, and I certainly, have to think about, why I became interested in these issues to begin with. I have conscientious objection in my own family. My grandfather was a conscientious objector from World War II, and then my father went and served in Vietnam. So we get it all backwards in my family.
Yeah,
completely backwards. But these issues have been haunting us, let's say, for many years, and very, interesting, asking these ethical questions about what is the right thing for a person to do. I think that in any case where you have an ethical moment or an ethical decision, you have a clash. You have a very interesting anthropological moment where the individual is thinking for themselves and thinking about what's the right thing to do, but always, always, always in dialogue with society and in dialogue with the collective. And that would be true in a place like the U.S., where you have a very strong emphasis on liberal rights and individual rights. And it's true even in places that don't rhetorically focus on the rights of the individual. Israel is a mixed bag in this. Is Israel a liberal Western place, or is it not? This is a very complicated question, not one that I'm going to try to answer here. But you certainly have within the group of conscientious objectors, but also within the law and also within the military, a lot of consensus that there is such a thing as freedom of conscience for the individual, which is a very liberal notion. The question is, what is freedom of conscience? What are its limits? Everyone will agree that this needs to be a reasonable conscience. What is then the juicy issue becomes what is reasonable. So you have on the one hand this really, really almost obsessive liberal obsession with what the individual rights and what they bring to the table and protecting the individual. On the other hand, even they will say it needs to be reasonable, which brings us right back to the collective. So in Israel, you've got this back and forth, this obviously very strong collective ethos and collective emphasis, but also a lot of liberal foundations and people who are really looking towards rights. And
I think that this is a tension that really has plagued Zionism from very, very early stages.
Sure, absolutely. I don't think it's unique here, though, because always when you're going to have a moment where maybe the individual is going to go against society, it's a moment in which the individual and the collective need to negotiate something. And that's not just in liberalism.
Yeah. All right, Dr. Erika Weiss, I'm afraid this is all we have time for. You are an anthropologist at Tel Aviv University, and your book, Conscientious Objectors in Israel, Citizenship, Sacrifice, Trials of Fealty, has just come out in English by Pennsylvania University Press. Thank you very much for coming in today.
Thank you so much.
That was the Tel Aviv Review for this week. Thank you very much for listening. Also, a big thanks to Alex Benish, the technical producer of this show. I am Gilad Halpern, signing off now in Tel Aviv. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. Until then, don't forget to follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and also don't hesitate to get in touch with your comments and suggestions to Gilad, G-I-L-A-D, at tlv1.fm. Hope to be joined by you again next week, and until then, goodbye.